Annapurna, Langtang, Sagarmatha, Everest. These mountains are our myth. A vision of what the world was like before man came. Remote, eternal, unchanging. The Himalayas. With the highest peaks and deepest valleys on Earth, the Himalayan range has challenged explorers from the West to test themselves against it, to conquer its summits. But for the people living here, these mountains have a different meaning. They believe these peaks are holy places, not the rightful home of men, but of gods. Shiva, their legends say, dwells on one of them, and from it he released the divine waters that provide all life below. The truth is, this mountain system has been the source of life for the Indian continent for thousands of years. Its rivers built and enriched the plains on which 1/10 of the world's population lives. Hundreds of millions of people depend for their survival on the streams flowing from above. But the water that brings life can bring death as well.
Floods wreak havoc in many parts of Upper India. Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Bengal are reeling under the fury of floods. Thousands of villages are underwater. Many people have been killed, and thousands of heads of cattle lost. Damage to crops is heavy.
And all because of what is happening here. For behind this facade of tranquil beauty, a catastrophe is in the making. Today, this mountain environment is on the brink of ecological disaster and a great human tragedy. Our story begins in the tiny landlocked kingdom of Nepal, the fabled Shangri-La. Ranging up the slopes of the Himalayas, with most of its population centered in the middle hills, Nepal is about the size of the state of Florida. One of the world's perfect landscapes, some of its poorest people. The village of Manigawan, where Kaziman and his brother Naina Singh live with their families. Like the vast majority of Nepalese, they are farmers. And to survive in this rugged terrain, they've carved their mountains into fields. All the work is done by hand. A typical family of 6 will own about half an acre, scattered up and down the face of the mountain.
त्यो रुख ढुङ्गादेखि उँधो उहाँ त गाई चरिया देखियो नि बाख्रा चरिया देखियो हो त्यहाँदेखि उमो खेत त्यति मेरो हो पल्लो खेत वल्लो खेत यो बाँझो जोत्यादेखि उँधो उहाँ तल ढुङ्गा पल्ला आएको गरा देखियो नि हो त्यो ढुङ्गा पल्ला आएको गरादेखि उमो यो जोत्यादेखि उँधो यति मेरो खेत त्यो र त्यो खेत चाहिँ त्यति बारी चाहिँ अब यहाँबाट लिएर उही भाइको नाइन सिंहको साथसम्म छ त्यहाँ देखिँदैन जम्मै
तपाईको अहिले खेती गर्दा चाहिँ वर्षभरि खानु
पुग्दैन
कति महिनासम्म
त्यही अब समयले दियो भनेदेखि 6 महिनालाई पुग्छ होइन भनेदेखि त्यही 5 महिना 6 महिना यस्तै छ अनि
5-6 महिना नपुग्दा है अनि बाँकी महिनामा चाहिँ तपाईले के गरेर आफ्नो जान परिवारलाई पाल्नु
कहिले निमे गर्ने कहिले यस्तै कर्मी काम गर्ने कहिले भारी बोउने कहिले उहाँहरू जस्तैको भारी बोउने लाङटाङ जाने यस्तै गरेर जान पाएन
Kaziman and Naina Singh live much as their father and grandfathers did before them, in a close and precarious connection to the land. Any catastrophe in nature means trouble for them as well.
वल्लो पहिरो र यो वल्लो तल्लो पहिरो गरेर नोक्सान गर्दै ल्याएर मेरो कोदरो यहाँदेखि उमो यो गरेदेखि उमो चाहिँ कोदरो बिहा थियो यति चाहिँ कोदो नोक्सान भयो त्यो मुरी 30-40 जति कोदो नोक्सान भयो होला साउनको 27-28 गते हो क्या त्यतिमा पहिरो गएको यतिमा गरेर मेरो कोदो त्यही हो एक मुरी जति 30-40 जति कोदो नोक्सान भयो होला धान के 3 मुरी 70 बाथि नोक्सान भयो मेरो
The loss of even a small piece of ground brings the threat of starvation to these villagers. Yet all across Nepal, farmers are seeing their precious land disappear before their eyes.
फुको बगैजिया थुम सोनु भडकै बगैजिया उनिका ले ठननो लोहनो लगादिगु माटे पत्र उकेनो छया मजु वावलटे फुको ठन दुलहे ठन लाइगु ले लागु लाज्यो जिमि चाहिँ पना पनि फुइमुगु रोकया मुगु ले चले दिया आ छे यो क्या लगा कटे तो लगा
यसमा पहिले राम्रो चौर थियो
हजुर
अनि यो असार साउन भदौमा धेरै पानी वर्षा भएको हुनाले अनि पानी बग्दाखेरि अनि त्यसरी डौडाराहरू पारेर अनि पहिरो गयो
बुढियामालाई पनि यो बारेमा थाहा छ हजुर भन्नुस् त
त्यही हो मलाई पनि त्यही अब यहाँ ढुङ्गो र मुडो गरेर आउँछ के रे उहाँ त आउँदाखेरि भर्काउँदै लान्छ
There was a village here once, right next to Manigawan.
ढुङ्गे गाउँको सिरानदेखि पहिरो आगो त्यहाँबाट त्यहाँ एउटा कानले छ्यास्स लड्यो त्यहाँबाट लड्दा पानी ठुलो मुसलधार पानी थियो त्यहाँबाट पानी झन् उँधो आयो झन् ठुलो झन् उँधो आयो झन् ठुलो झन् उँधो आयो झन् ठुलो गाउँ समाप्त भएर चाहिँ
आतंक चल्यो कोही मर्ने मरिगयो नमर्ने एउटा दुईटा बाँचेको त्यो पहिरो उतापट्टि यतापट्टिको छेउछेउकोहरूले रुनु थाल्यो कराउनु थाल्यो अन्त के भयो कसो भयो भएर चाहिँ हामी जाँदाखेरि पहिरो गएछ त्यो दिन हामी वार त्यो दिन त के 3 दिनसम्म पनि त्यो पहिरो उता यता हामी उताको उतै यताको यतै ओहोरदोहोर गर्न नसक्नेसम्म भयो त्यस्तो भयो अन्त त्यताबाट भोलिपल्टै होइन मिलिटरी आएको उदाहरण सरकारको मिलिटरी आएर जाँचबुझ गर्यो जम्मै दुनियाँ संसार दङ पर्यो अब जिउँदो पनि मरेको जतिकै भयो त्यो बिनाको गाउँ जम्मै समाप्त लाँदाखेरि त त्यसै दङ पर्यो
Clearly, these mountains are not as stable and unchanging as they appear. To understand why, we have to know something of their history and of the land that formed them. About 150 million years ago, the great southern continent we call Gondwana land began to break up. The landmass that is now India split off from it and slowly drifted northward. Then, some 40 million years ago, it collided with the Asiatic continent. Great slabs of the continental crust were forced upward. Over thousands of centuries, this constant pressure from beneath built the Himalayan range. The new hills trapped moist winds from the south, Rains pounded the slopes, eroding them. Rivers developed and carried the sediment downstream to form the rich plains of India and Bangladesh. This process continues today. The Himalayas are still growing, an inch or more every year. Earthquake, landslide, flood are all part of this growing process. They're bound to occur, especially in Nepal, because this land forms a great drainage system for the rains and melted snow of the Himalayas. The people here live on the slopes of a vast watershed, and over the centuries they've learned to survive in this precarious environment, until recently, when that uneasy balance between man and nature began to shift toward disaster. The human population of Nepal has doubled during the last several decades. In 1981, it stood at 14 million. At the same time, the number of landslides here has accelerated enormously. Experts say soil loss is twice what would be expected to occur naturally. And as their need for food and shelter increases, these people are discovering that the ingenious methods they've relied upon in the past no longer work. Nature refuses to cooperate.
जसरी हुन्छ यसलाई त ढुङ्गा पल्टाउने पर्खल सोझ्याउने पहिरो गएको ठाउँमा बनाउने गर्नुपर्छ.
Traditionally, hill people have terraced their land to better irrigate crops and keep topsoil from washing away. These well-maintained terraces on gentle slopes don't provide enough to feed the growing population anymore. So farmers have pushed upward, hastily cutting fields on steep ground. After 1 or 2 rainy seasons, these new fields are gone. As for livestock in these hills, well, the local farmers have a saying: no fodder, no cattle. No cattle, no manure. No manure, no crops.
तपाईले के गर्नु भएको यो? तपाईले के गर्नुहुन्छ?
कहिले अहिले कि गोरुलाई घाँस हाल्न है जोत्नलाई गोरु अगाउनु पर्यो नि. भैँसी 2टा छ. त्यो भैँसी 2टा ब्याए दुध खाने, नब्याए थारै बसेछ भने मल हुन्छ. त्यो मल लगेर खेतबारीमा हाल्यो. मकै फल्छ, कोदो फल्छ, धान फल्छ. त्यो मलले आफू खानु पाइयो. गोरु हल गोरु छ. गोरुलाई पाल्यो, पोषण गर्यो. उसको बल छ उन्जेललाई जोत्यो हल गोरुले. त्यताबाट 4-5वटा बाख्रा छ. त्यो बाख्रा पनि ब्यायो भनेदेखि बदान बढी हुन्छ. धेर भयो भने बिज्यो, बोको ब्यायो भने बिज्यो. पैसा अलिअलि भेटायो भने लुगा फाटोको बाटो लुगा लाउने, तेल मसला खाने गर्यो. त्यति हो वस्तुको चाहिँ नाउँमा.
Farmers here see their livestock as a solution to some of life's ills, but in reality, these animals have become part of the problem, because their population is growing too. Vegetation is stripped from the hillsides to provide them with fodder. Animals allowed to wander free destroy any vestige of new growth. But there is an even greater threat to the slopes. These hill people have always depended on firewood to cook their food, heat their homes. The forests of Nepal are their source of fuel. People of Manigawan still remember when a day's wood supply could be gathered in an hour, maybe less.
बिहान सबेरै नै यहाँ भात खाएर अनि त्यो डाँडो खाजा लिएर जानुपर्छ अनि बेलुका आइपुग्छ घर अलि हिँड्नु सक्ने चाहिँ अलिकति घाम भेट्न आउँछ हिँड्नु नसक्ने चाहिँ घाम डुबेपछि आइपुग्छ
अनि त्यो लागेको भारी चाहिँ कति दिनसम्म आउँछ
3 दिन 4 दिन अब यस्तो छाउराहरुले ल्याएको त अब 2 दिनलाई देखि हुँदैन अलि तपाई हामी जस्तोले ल्याएको चाहिँ 4 दिन 5 दिनलाई हुन्छ पहिले यहाँतिर नै पाउँथ्यो है त्यो डाँडो यही आफ्नै बना पाउँथ्यो त्यो डाँडो झन् पर अब सक्दै गएपछि त झन् पर हुँदा हुँदा अहिले सारै नै आबाद हुँदै गयो मान्छे धेरै भयो अनि उडाडो नि ती काट्ने उडाडो नि ती काट्ने गर्दा गर्दै मासिदै गएको
Within the last decade, Nepal has lost almost a third of its forests. In 10 years more, they could all be gone. As long as there is vegetation on a slope, the ground is protected. Rainfall can be regulated, because a tree acts as a sponge. It absorbs moisture and releases it gradually. Its roots keep the soil in place. But when the tree is gone, ground becomes vulnerable to erosion. Rainfall runs unchanneled across the land, and the topsoil goes with it. Eroded hillsides, disappearing forests. This is happening not just in Manigawan, but in thousands of other villages all across the Himalayas. Naked slopes mean disaster for this mountain environment. The monsoons come to this region every summer, bringing more rainfall in 4 months than even England gets in 5 years. Lately, the people of Manigawan have come to dread them.
बर्षा ठुलो भयो भनेदेखि अनि त्यो डाँडो रातभरि त्यसै जागराम बस्नु पर्यो एकपल्ट बगेर चाहिँ समाप्त भएर चाहिँ बग्ने बगिगयो मर्ने मरिगयो बाँध्नेलाई पनि फेरि पनि लाने हो कि फेरि पनि लाने हो भन्ने डर भएर चाहिँ पानी पर्न थाल्यो कि अनि बस्नु पर्ने जागै
हाम्रो गाउँ गाउँमा घर घरमा जान जम्मा भएर लालिन बालेर टस बालेर जागराम बस्नु पर्ने के हाम्रो गाउँमा त्यस्तो अब उज्यालो रात घाम नलागुन्जेललाई उज्यालो नहुन्जेललाई भनौँ न उज्यालो नहुन्जेललाई कसरी उज्यालो होला भन्ने सम्मको डर भएर हामी बस्नु पर्ने
वर्षा बगेर उहाँ त अब भिरालो छ गरे जम्मै भिरै छ गरे फेर हुँदाखेरि पानी जम्मै यो परिएर आयो आउँदाखेरि भर्काउँदै लो अब उता अब खेती गरेर आउँदाखेरि पनि अब भलबाडी हुँदाखेरि मुन्छै गइन्छ कि गाई भैँसी जान्छन् कि त्यो डर पनि हुने भयो के अरे यसरी भर्काउँदै जाँदाखेरि अब यहाँ हिँड्न हुँदैन थियो के अरे यो बाटो अब यो सुहाएर त हिँड्थे हेरि यो गराट हिँड्थे बाटो मैले साँच्चै भनेको नानीले पनि साँच्चै देखिराख्नु भएछ अब सबै जनताहरूले देखिराखेको
There's little protection from the torrential rains now in Monegawan. In fact, almost everywhere upstream, monsoon damage is increasing. But downstream, the results are far worse. As the waters rush down to the plains below, they gather sediment from the naked slopes, ton upon ton of topsoil and rocks, all of it pouring into the river below, adding force to these waters, increasing their power to destroy. The river rises, and finally it overflows. Yet in spite of treacherous currents, local people must go on crossing the river every day. Their livelihood depends on it. Nearly 48,000 square miles of northern India were affected by floods in 1978. That's 4 times the area flooded only 25 years ago. Millions were left homeless, thousands dead. And these plains at the foot of the Himalayas are India's most important food-producing region. Millions of dollars worth of crops were lost. Famine threatened one of the most densely populated places on Earth.
यो खोलाले अब हेरि यहाँ चाहिँ उनको मेरो यसो थियो जग्गा हेरु त्यो बुटा त्यो किरो देखेको छ नि हो त्यहाँसम्मको कुनेर खच्चै पारेर यो सिमलको रुख त माथ जम्मा थियो अब के गर्नु
यहाँ नराम्रो लाग्यो खै यस्तो खोलाले यस्तो गरेछ
अनि तपाईहरुको यहाँ जग्गा कतिको गएको छ
भनौं न 1 बिघा 5 गट्ठा भनेकोमा नापेकोमा अब 5 गट्ठा त रापतिले लगिदियो.
In recent years, there has been a steady migration down to the flatlands called the Terai. Over a third of Nepal's population has already abandoned the hills and moved here. This was a dense, malaria-infested jungle only 30 years ago, where rhinoceros and Bengal tiger roamed. Then in the 1950s, malaria was eradicated, and settlers began to arrive. They cleared trees, cultivated the land, and soon others followed. This narrow plain became the safety valve for Nepal's overpopulated hills. But today, the Terai suffers from the same loss of forest and cropland that the hills do, and it can't support many more people.
अब तपाईहरुको के इच्छा छ यही बसिरहने इच्छा छ कि अर्को ठाउँमा पनि राम्रो पायो भने जाने
हजुरहरुको आशिक पातले तर हामी टाढो नजाम हामी नजिकै बसौँ हामीलाई किन हामी टाढो जाम पो भने हामी भन्न पर्यो यहाँको इष्टमित्रलाई पनि अहिले मरि गयो भने पनि हामीलाई फाल्ने मान्छे कुनै हुन्नन् बिरानो देशमा गयौँ भने हामी तर टाढा नजाम नजिकै बसौँ
The fate of these downstream people is linked to those living upstream in ways they may not be aware of. For what happens here in these hills will determine the future productivity of the plains below. And up here, the mountain environment has reached the limit of its ability to support human life.
अब अरु छोराछोरी नभएको किन त नमन लाग्यो किन भनौ न
अरु छोराछोरी अब पुग्यो धेरै छोराछोरी भए दुःख पाउँछ अब खानु दिनु सक्दैन लाउनु दिनु सक्दैन भएर पनि के गर्दिउ सुँगुरको जस्तो बदा हिँडेर भएन खानु दिनु सकेन भने लाउनु दिनु सकेन भने आफ्नो इज्जत हुर्मात गइहाल्छ
त्यसले जाने अब तपाईहरुको छोराछोरीहरु पनि धेरै छन् हैन त
अब नहोस् भनेर हुँदैन त
अब त्यहाँ हाम्रो परिवार नियोजनहरु पनि त छन् नि हैन त
छ भन्छ अब आफुलाई भएको छैन
केही पनि भएन
त्यो पत्ता नभएको कुरा भयो त्यो नबुझेको कुरा भयो नि हजुर आफुलाई त भो अब छोराछोरी भो भन्न आने छ अब भो भनेर भोरा भगवानले दिएपछि पहिला चाहिँ नपाएर एउटा छोरो पाइदियो भने कस्तो हुन्थ्यो एउटा छोरी पाइदिनु कस्तो हुन्थ्यो भन्ने कत्रो रार हुन्छ कत्रो तपस्या हुन्छ तपस्या गरेर चाहिँ बसिरहेको हुन्छ उनीहरुले नपाउने आफुलाई भएको छोराछोरी बढ्दा भयो यो चाहिँ नपाइदिनु हुन्थ्यो भनेर त भएन हेर्नु
Half the babies born in Nepal die before they are 5 years old. Even so, the population here can be expected to increase by 7 million in the next 2 decades. Only 1 in 6 of these children will ever learn to read or write.
भविष्यमा तपाईको बच्चाहरुलाई दुःख हुन्छ कि हुँदैन जस्तो लाग्छ
दुःख त किन नहुनु आफुलाई त यस्तो दुःख झन् छाउराहरुलाई त किन दुःख नहुनु घाँस पानी पाउँदैन त्यताडो खेतीपाती हुँदैन अहिले जस्तो आउ हुँदैन आउ जस्तो पाउ हुँदैन खोला पहिरो लागेर चाहिँ बिमार हुँदै गयो वर्षौनी बगे पहिरो अहिले बनायो आउँदा छैन
In ages past, when people destroyed the environment that sustained them, their societies collapsed. The individuals moved on. But for these hill people, there is no place left to go.
खानी मुख बढ्दै छन् तर जग्गा बढ्दैन. That is, which says that the number of people to be fed are increasing every day, every week, every month, and every year. But the land we cannot stretch. The land is same. Actually, it is going down. It is being washed off. The population grows. There are more and more people to be fed. But the land doesn't grow. The yield is going down. And the soil, the fertile soil, is being washed off.
समुद्र स्थल होस् स्थल समुद्र होस् ठुलो पर्वत समान होस् र पर्वत ठुलो समान होस् भगवानको इच्छा जो छ त्यही हुन्छ भनेर हाम्रो धर्मशास्त्रहरुमा भगवानको इच्छालाई आरोपण गर्ने चलन छ तर मानिसले आफूले आफैलाई बनाउने र बिगार्ने आफ्नै हातमा छ
In the 1970s, the government of Nepal realized it was facing a crisis, the destruction of the Himalayas, the deepening hunger and poverty of its people. So with the help of several international agencies, the Nepalese began to take steps to deal with it. One of the first tasks was to try to find a way to tame the wild waters that threatened their land. This is the Phewha Tal watershed, where the Nepalese government has undertaken an experiment in integrated land management. There are thousands of such natural watershed areas in Nepal, places where rainfall and melted snow flow down into a single drainage point. In this case, the waters drain into Phewha Lake. Many slopes here are severely eroded. The lake is silting up at an alarming rate. When conservation officials arrived a few years ago, they set about identifying areas where most of the damage was occurring. They built check dams to slow runoff in the gullies. Then they reforested some of these slopes, targeted others to be fenced off from livestock. Grasses were planted and protected. Farmers cut them by hand and stall-fed their animals. Destructive overgrazing was eliminated. Now, 5 years later, growth on protected land is impressive. Phewha Tal has become a model for what can be accomplished in other watersheds throughout Nepal. But how do the people living here feel about the changes?
खै अब हामीले चाहिँ यही सोचेका थियौँ अब यसरी यो हाम्रो चाहिने यो निकास पानीघाट डिया बस्तु चर्ने खर्कनी बहने ठाउँ अब यो भूसंरक्षणले लिएपछि यहाँ साह्रै नै असुविधा भयो अब कहाँ जाने के गर्ने भन्ने हामीलाई यही सोचेका थियौँ हेर्नुहोस्
पहिला हामीलाई पन्दालीमा आएर पाल टाङ्ने बेलामा त्यस्तो लाग्यो पहिला सुरुमा अनि पछि त्यहाँ पन्दाली त काम गर्दै आउँदा विश्वास पर्दै आयो अनि यहाँ त काम गर्दै त्यो भदौरीसँग जानुभयो अँधेरी खोलासँग अहिले जम्मै जग्गामा राम्रो हुँदै आइसक्यो
मतलब रुखहरू उम्रन थालेपछि
रुखहरू उम्रियो अनि नभए जग्गामा वृक्षरोपण गरिसक्यो त्यहाँ पहिरो चलिसक्यो हैन त्यहाँ पहिरो चलिसक्यो धेरै पहिरोहरू किया छ
अनि तपाईहरुले यहाँ यो अर्पण खोला हाम्रो अब यस्तो माटो बगेर गएपछि हैन कसरी
अलिकति माटो यति पानीमा माटो बग्यो भने तल जाँदा पानी यति
हुन्छ जम्मै तमिलो हुन्छ खाने पानी पनि हुँदैन अनि भर्खर तपाईहरुले कुरा गर्नु भएको छ नि यो पानी यो नाप्ने भाँडो छ नि टंकीहरुको त्यो भित्र पानी कति हुन्छ अरे
To measure the rate of soil erosion here, the project set up an experiment, comparing two plots on the same slope. The first tank collects water and sediment from an overgrazed piece of land, the runoff from a 10-square-meter area above the tank. Virtually all the night's rain has run off into the tank, taking the topsoil with it. Over a year's time, they calculate about 5 tons of soil per acre would be lost this way. The second tank collects its moisture from the adjoining plot, a protected young pine plantation. Very little water is drained into this tank, and the soil loss is less than 1/10 of that from the overgrazed plot.
कसरी के भएर हुँदो रहेछ तपाईले विचार गर्नु भयो होला नि त्यो विषयमा
हामीलाई कस्तो विश्वास लाग्यो यो जंगलले हरिया झार्ने पानी सोख्दो रहेछ
पानी त्यति रोक्दो रहेछ
पानी रोकेर सोसिदिनु रहेछ
बाहिर रोक्दो रहेछ
त्यसको जराले यहाँ पानी जति पर्यो उति बगिहिल्दो रहेछ
हरियो वन हजुर नेपालको दहन
भनौं
Auristan, Haisa, Danistan, Haisa, Daradila, Haisa, Auristan, Haisa, Dargamar, Haisa, Nichols, Haisa, Haisa, Haisa,
Nepal's wealth may soon be gone if present practices continue.
हैसा हैसा गारा बोल हैसा हैसा बोल हैसा दूरे ठिला हैसा और तान हैसा गारा तान
What's desperately needed here is some source of fuel other than firewood. One possibility, the sun.
I think the use of solar energy in the field of agriculture and industry is very, very important for Nepal. Let's say, for example, we had made study for one tobacco industry in Nepal who is using 20,000 kilograms of firewood for one season. That's a lot of firewood. So if we could just get, let's say, a simple system which could reduce only 50% of the firewood, then we could have done a lot. And besides that, there are many other industries who are solely depending upon firewood. And in such cases, I think we could improve the system or reduce the firewood or other fuel consumption with the use of solar energy. We can see how hot it is, the water coming out of this collector. It is very efficient and it goes temperature up to 62, 65 degrees Fahrenheit, no, centigrade, or 130, 135 Fahrenheit. And this water is very hot.
Solar heaters are providing a valuable source of power for Nepal. But for now, they're used mostly in urban areas, in schools, hospitals, and hotels. There is solar potential in the hills, of course, but these collectors cost upwards of $200 each, which puts them far out of the reach for the average villager, whose annual cash income is apt to be around $24. So the search for alternative fuel goes on. Mrs. Yagna Bahadur and her family live on the outskirts of Pokhara, one of Nepal's larger towns. Until recently, she used to go out and collect firewood like everybody else.
कति 7 बजे गएपछि बेलुकाको 6 बजे आउँछन् त्यति टाढा जानु पर्छ त्यो सजिलो हो भिरमा खोज्नु पर्यो नाउलो चाहियो हाँसी चाहियो बन्धन चाहियो भारी हाल्नु पर्यो फेरि बोक्नु पर्यो गाह्रो हिजो आज आनन्दले बसेर पकाउन कति सजिलो हो
Today, Mrs. Yagna Bahadur uses another kind of fuel, biogas.
उनले धुवा भयो आँखा कतरा लाग्यो आँखा दुखे
भाँडाकुँडा पनि सफाइ रहन्छ
यसमा सफाइ रहन्छ यस्तै यही हजुर यी बस्दा यसमा पकाइदियो यस्तै हो त्यसपछि भित्र खखाले मात्र भएन डढ्दैन कालो मैला लाग्दैन बिहान यसैमा दाल पकाएको त यहाँ कोही मैला लाग्यो अब पकाउँदाखेरि धुवा भयो त्यही सुक्ख भयो बनाएको दाल ल्याउनु पर्ने त्यही सुक्ख भयो त्यो गाह्रो भयो धेरै सुक्ख भयो नि अब दुडा चुला बनाइदिए छोराले भने झन् आनन्दी हो दाउरे चाहिएन मजा असित बस्छु छोड्छु हेरा मेरो बस्यो काम बिजुली छ अचेलको आइमेर कति सुख छ
त्यति नै हुन्छ
पानीले
Biogas is made by mixing farmyard manure with water. It ferments inside the tank, and methane gas is released. The Yagna Bahadur family was one of the first in Nepal to install a biogas unit.
यहाँले यो गोबर ग्यास प्लान्ट नि कहिलेदेखि स्थापना गर्नु भएको
थियो 2030 साल अहिले करिब 7 वर्ष
अनि यहाँले कसबाट यो प्रेरणा पाउनु भएको
यो पहिला हाम्रो यस बाटोले चौरमा पिस्कोर तालिमको लागि चाहिँ पिस्कोरहरू आएको थिए त्यसमध्येमा एकजना बरड अमेरिकन मेरो घरमा बस्दथे उनको सल्लाह अनुसार यो गोबर ग्यास बनाएको हो।
पैसा पर्ने कुरो नै केही नै त्यसको।
अनि पछि यसमा के दिनभरिमा के गर्नुपर्छ यो ग्यास निकाल्नु?
त्यही एउटा मोल राउँछौँ, 4 गाडी 5 गाडी पानी लाउँछौँ, 10-12 भारी जति 6-7 भारी मोल राउँछौँ। त्यही हो हाम्रो काम। तौलित पनि त्यही हो। चिया पकाउने, बिहान जुर्काउँछु, चिया पका, कुँडो पका, अनि त्यहाँ तरकारी दाल बसाल्यो, तरकारी बसाल्यो। फेरि जान परिवार धेरै भएपछि 2 ठाउँ गर्नु पर्यो। जान थोरै उनलाई त केही चाहिएन, त्यो सुविस्तै हुन्थ्यो। साह्रै सुविस्ता, सुख।
The slurry, a byproduct of biogas, turns out to be an enriched fertilizer.
गनाउने चाहिँ कुरा केही पनि छैन यसमा। खेती बोट बिरुवाहरूलाई डबल मात्रामा तेजस भएर राम्रो मोलिलो काम दिन्छ।
The use of biogas is increasing in Nepal, and it can provide a safe alternative fuel for people living at the lower altitudes, where temperatures are warm enough for fermentation to take place. But perhaps the best potential source of power here comes from what these people have been using for centuries: water. Now, with modern technology, they're trying to exploit this abundant resource. Here at Kulakani Dam, they are building a plant to generate hydroelectricity. It's the largest engineering project ever undertaken in Nepal. The potential for hydroelectric power on these slopes is enormous, the experts say. So are the problems. It's a risky business, constructing huge projects on unstable hills. If the mountains upstream continue to erode, sending tons of debris downriver, the reservoirs will silt up. The dams may not hold in this earthquake-prone environment. There is simply no way to escape the fundamental problem here: the gradual destruction of this Himalayan environment. If this process is not reversed, and soon, catastrophe is inevitable. Torrential monsoons will create ever more massive landslides. These slopes will become an alpine desert, and downstream flooding will destroy the life support system for hundreds of millions of people. The enormity of the problem is almost beyond comprehension. But one key to its solution lies here with these upstream people. Somehow, they must find a way to take from their environment what food, fuel, and fodder they need, while at the same time restoring it. If one were to design from scratch a single device that would produce fuel, stabilize hillsides and protect them from erosion, utilize ground not suitable for crops, retain moisture and slow runoff, it would be hard to come up with anything more ideal than a tree. The climate here is subtropical, and these lands have a remarkable ability to regenerate, given time and care. In about 7 years, they could look like this. It is estimated that some 2 million acres will have to be reforested over the next 20 years to meet the needs of the population. That's about 15% of the acreage of these middle hills, a mammoth task for Nepal.
For this, keeping this environment or this the ecology, or the mountain ecology intact, or bring it back to probably where it was. Here, the involvement of the local community, I feel, is very, very, very important.
A few years ago, here in Chotara, Mr. Mahat pioneered a novel approach to forestry. He believed that people will work to solve their own problems, given the opportunity. So he mobilized the local farmers, and together they set about to restore their environment. And it's working.
The local population has a problem of firewood and fodder and construction timber for their houses and their sheds and farm sheds and all that. So this sort of, at least in the future, to meet the needs of the local people on this. So we have been trying to work on this. So the beginning of this was to start a nursery and trying to plant trees of, most of it was pines, of course, the local pines, but slowly we are mixing up with all sorts of trees that would be for construction and commercial timber, as well as for fuel wood, fodder wood, and then fruits and that type of thing. Last monsoon, about mid-July, we had about 300,000 plants raised in this nursery.
Local farmers built the nursery with the help of Mahat and his staff. They do all the work themselves, mainly because the nursery belongs to them, it and the forest lands beyond. The government has turned over ownership of the entire project to the local communities. They manage the forests themselves through their own committees. Here, farmers from one village urge others to become more actively involved.
पहिला 2 वर्ष 3 वर्ष अगाडि नैदेखि यो बाँझे खेतको चाहिँ देवीथानमा रुखहरू धेरै मासिएर त्यहाँ बिर्से रोपन गर्नु पर्यो बढाउनु पर्यो भन्ने चाहिँ यी 2 नम्बर वडाका चाहिँ साथीहरूले चाहिँ धेरै गरिरहेका छन्। त्यसको लागि चाहिँ पञ्चायतले पनि अलिकति चाहिँ विचार गरिदिनु पर्यो, लापरवाही गरिदिनु भएन र चाहिँ फेरि त्यसमाथि बिरुवा पनि थप्नु पर्यो अलिकति। त्यहाँ लगेर रोप्नु पर्यो वरिपरि।
त्यसो गर्नुहुन्छ भने ठिकै छ भन्नुस् न। त्यो कुरालाई हामी तुरुन्तै यता सबैजनाबाट सहयोग गरेर त्यसलाई साथ गर्छौँ। तपाईहरु पुरै निकाल्नु हुन्न त्यो 10 वर्ष तपाईहरु काम त्यहाँ रोप्ने गर्ने। हैन यो त मैले 4-5 वर्ष अगाडि थिए भने उहाँहरुलाई। म चाहिँ त्यस ठाउँमा गएर हेर्दाखेरि के गर्नु भएको छ उहाँले भने देवीखानको त ठुलो रुख चाहिँ ब्ड्याङ काटेर ढुङ्गा काट्न दिनुभएको छ। अनि त्यो दिँदाखेरि चाहिँ अर्का चाहिँ ठुला ठाडो आएर चाहिँ त्यो लग्दिए।
त्यो त चाहिँ टुप्पाडा मर्दै आएको रुख थियो र चाहिँ यो चाहिँ पञ्चायतले पनि चाहिँ यो काट्न हुने रुख र चाहिँ यहाँ बिर्से रोपन गर्नुपर्छ भनेर चाहिँ भने उनीहरूले चाहिँ यसका बदला 5 वटा सारमा भनेर चाहिँ छोडिदिए मात्रै हो त्यो। भन्दैछौँ माग्दैछौँ
नसार्ने अब चाहिँ लाठा ट्याम बितिसकेपछि चाहिँ सार्दै
नर्सरी भएको कम्युनिटी वर्ष अहिले चाहिँ कति वर्ष सुरु भयो तपाईलाई आज पनि थाहा छैन क्या?
आज किन 5 वर्षसम्म तपाईँ चुप लाग्नु भयो? 5 वर्ष अघिदेखि नै माग्दैछौँ हामी।
लगाउनु पर्यो अहिले चाहिँ
हो त तपाईले किन पोहोर गरेर नदिया त्यस ठाउँलाई बिरुवा?
हामी त जहिले पनि दिनको लागि तयारै छौँ नि, जहिले पनि दिइराखेकै छौँ नि। अब तपाईले लिन नआएपछि तपाईँ घर पुर्याउन त अब अलि मुस्किल
हो त नि। तपाईको गल्ती देखिन्छ त्यसमा। त्यो वृक्ष चाहिँ तपाईले यो चाहिँ बिरुवा लगाएर त्यहाँ लाउनु पर्छ उइबाट
चाहिँ सिजन छ, सिजनमा
अब आज यो छलफलमा आएर तपाईले झगडा गरेर पाउनु कुरा छ त?
तपाईले माग्दा पो समयमा आएर खुसी त गर्न कसले दिन्छ?
तपाईले वृक्ष माग्या हुनु पर्छ बिरुवा।
अब अहिले चाहिँ सिजन छ, बोकल खाने सिजन छ। अहिले तपाईहरुले गएर त्यो ठाउँमा बोकल खानी राख्नुछ कि त्यो ठाउँमा कति बिरुवा चाहिन्छ, कुन जातको बिरुवा लगाउने हो, त्यो सबै जातको बिरुवा यहाँ चाहिँ नर्सरीमा उपलब्ध छ कि तपाईहरु आउनुस्, तपाईँ बिरुवा लिएर त्यो ठाउँमा गएर रोपिहाल्नुस्।
Today, there are only a handful of community-owned forest projects in Nepal, but they provide a model for others to follow. If every village in this country planted 5 to 10 acres of trees each year, there would be enough firewood to supply the entire population of Nepal. And if proper conservation practices were introduced throughout the country, 85% of its watershed could be restored and made productive. The Himalayan environment can be saved. But the task is enormous, the time short, and the vast majority of hill people feel isolated from these new beginnings.
अब पछिको मैले हिजो नै हजुरलाई भने है अब किन भन्नु होला भनेदेखि हाम्रो यो कुना कप्चामा पहाडमा हेर्नु तरिका सिकाइदिने इष्टमित्र भनौँ न तरिका सिकाइदिने इष्टमित्र पायो भनेदेखि त हामी पनि गर्न सक्छौँ कि यो खेती किसानीबाट चाहिँ किन भन्नु होला भनेदेखि आफू सङ्गत पनि छैन आफूले लेखापढी गरे जानेको पनि छैन लेखापढी पनि जानेको छैन सङ्गत पनि जानेको छैन उति साह्रो गाउँघर छरछिमेकीले पनि यस्तो गर्दा यस्तो हुन्छ यस्तो गर्दा यस्तो हुन्छ भनेर खुबै जाने बुझ्या छैन हेर्नु त्यसो भए हुनाले अब कहाँबाट चाहिँ कुन चाहिँ काम गर्दाखेरि सफल हुन्छ राम्रो हुन्छ यो चाहिँ ठाउँ पाएन हजुर खुसी त लाग्छ त खुसी नलागिकन त त्यसै बसेर त कर्कापले यहाँ बसेर त हुँदैन तर एउटा कुरो त करै लाग्छ हेर्नुहोस् किन भन्नु भने अलि भएको खेतबारी पनि बेचेर हिँडौँ भनेदेखि उहाँ पनि किन्नै पर्यो यस्तै जीविका गर्नै पर्यो भनेदेखि जस्तो छ आफ्नो चाहिँ अवस्थाल यस्तै ठाउँमा आफ्नो जन्म भयो अब यस्तै ठाउँमा चाहिँ चल्दै चल्दै गएर चाहिँ केही न केही उद्यम देखाएर चाहिँ खान सकिएन हामीले हेर्नु गरौँला भन्ने त मनमा त छ तर गरौँला भनेर मात्रै पनि भएन नि
काँडे पर्जेटले दिएर 200 सल्लो सारेको छु
कहाँ
वहाँ
पल्ला पहिरा
200 सल्लो एक्लै सार्नु भएको
दिनदिनै अब खाडल खनेको छ आज र भोलि 2 दिन हारेर
कति दिन लाग्यो तपाईँलाई त्यतिका
2 दिन
अहिले तपाईँ त्यसबाट कतिको फाइदा देख्नु भएको छ तपाईँ
अब भोलि ठुलो भएपछि त फाइदै होला नि फाइदै होला भनेर रुपियाँ छ नि
आफूलाई नभए पनि हैन छोराछोरी नाति
पलातीका पाला होला अब हाम्रै पाला त त्यो निश्चय हुँदैन होला
अब चाहिँ अलिकति थाहा हुँदै आयो कि अब यसरी चाहिँ सुरक्षा गर्दै लगेपछि त अब भोलि यो छोराछोरीहरूलाई पनि अलि राम्रै हुन जान्छ
These mountain people are attempting something no society on earth has ever done before. They're trying not to leave their despoiled environment, as others have in ages past, but to stay and change the way they live with it, to find a new balance between themselves and these fragile mountains.